The wedding chamber had been prepared for a queen. Silver candles burned along every wall. Moon-white roses covered the bed in pale, perfect layers. A crown rested on a velvet cushion beside a sealed marriage contract, as if the room itself had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. Everything in the room, said Seraphina Vey, had been chosen. Everything except the man standing 10 steps away from her. Alpha King Cassian had not removed his gloves. He had not stepped closer. He had not looked at the bed. He looked at Seraphina the way a man looks at a flame he has sworn not to touch, not with hatred, not with disgust, but with a discipline so controlled it had long since become its own kind of distance. Then he spoke. "I will give you everything this kingdom owes its queen." His voice was calm, formal, the voice of a man reciting something he had decided in advance. "I will give you rooms of your own, guards who answer to you, a seat beside me in court, protection from every enemy who thinks this marriage made you weak." Seraphina had prepared herself for many things on this night. A cold husband, a cruel one who might remind her that she came from a weakened house and owed this crown everything. She had not prepared herself for a man offering her a throne while keeping both hands at his sides. "But I will never kiss you." The silver candles snapped in the silence. Seraphina's breath came short. Cassian's jaw had tightened, as if the words had cost him something he was not willing to name. "I will never take you to my bed. I will never touch you as a husband, and I will never ask you to pretend this marriage is anything more than a crown agreement." The room felt very cold. "Do I disgust you so much?" she asked. Something moved behind his eyes. Not cruelty, something worse, something that looked like pain held at an exact distance from his face. "No," he said. That one word almost hurt worse than yes. Because he did not follow it with anything. He only turned away, his gloved hand closing around the door handle with a grip that was 1 degree too tight. Behind Seraphina, the candles flared, blue, just for a heartbeat, silver blue, the color of winter moonlight refracting through river ice, and then gone. She thought grief had made her imagine it. Cassian had not imagined it. His entire body went rigid, facing the door. "Do not let anyone see that," he said. His voice was lower now, not cold. "Careful." Seraphina looked at the candles, then at the line of his shoulders. "What was that?" He turned. For the first time that night, something in his expression cracked at the edges. Before he could answer, bells rang from the western tower. Not celebration. The clean, clipped sequence of a council summons. Bloodline inspection. Cassian crossed the room in 3 strides, and his gloved hand caught her wrist before she could move toward the door. It was the first time he had touched her. Heat tore through Seraphina's skin. Not the heat of a hand. Not the warmth of contact, but something deeper and older, a fire that lived beneath her veins and recognized the touch the way a sleeping thing recognizes the sound that wakes it. Silver blue burned under her skin for 3 full seconds before Cassian released her. He stepped back as if touching her had scorched him. His voice dropped to something close to warning. "If they ask whether I kissed you, say no." Seraphina's throat was tight. Why? Outside the door, boot steps approached in formation. Cassian looked at her mouth. Then at the blue fire still trembling beneath the surface of her wrist. And in that moment, standing in the wedding chamber he had refused to claim, Seraphina understood that the Alpha King had not kept his distance because he hated her. He had kept his distance because something inside her was waiting to wake, and one kiss might tell the entire kingdom exactly what she was. The council arrived in pairs, 6 of them, in gray ceremonial coats, led by a woman with silver gray hair and the patient expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Lady Marceline Voss, head of the High Council, the woman who had sent the bells. Seraphina stood at Cassian's left and kept her hands still, and her wrist covered by her sleeve and her face at the exact angle she had learned in childhood for rooms that required, you two, be present without being visible. Marceline's inspection was brief but precise. She looked at Seraphina's hands. She looked at the unmarked marriage contract on the cushion, the wax still unbroken, which meant nothing to most people, and everything to someone who knew what it meant when a royal alpha did not press his signet through the seal on the wedding night. The tradition requires confirmation, Marceline said. A bloodline inspection is standard for every royal bride. The marriage has not been consummated, Cassian said. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Marceline's gaze did not flicker. All the more reason. My queen is not subject to inspection on a night she has not yet had time to rest. A pause. The council will return. They left. And Seraphina stood in the middle of the wedding chamber and understood what had just happened to her. She had been publicly announced as untouched. By morning, the court would know. By noon, the whispers would have shaped themselves into something specific and cruel. The king had rejected his bride. The queen was unmarked. The marriage was political performance and nothing more. And Seraphina, who had spent her whole life learning how to be useful and small, and exactly the right shape, for whatever room she stood in, realized she did not know what shape to make herself now. 3 days passed. Cassian gave her everything he had promised: the queen's suite, the guards, the court seat, the charity funds, every public honor the kingdom could offer. She did not have an explanation. On the 3rd morning, Seraphina went to the moon chapel alone. It was early enough that the priests were still in their cells, and the chapel held only the pale quiet of dawn, coming through colored glass. She sat in the front pew and looked at an old carved panel above the altar, wolves running in a ring around a central flame, and she reached out, not thinking, and pressed her fingertips to the carved fire. Silver blue light bloomed in the stone under her touch. A priest who had entered silently from the side door made a sound like a man who had swallowed something wrong. "Blood fever," he said. His voice was thick with something that was not quite fear, but was closely related to it. Cassian appeared from the far side of the chapel before Seraphina could respond. She had not known he was there. He silenced the priest with 2 words, and a look that made the man find somewhere else to be very quickly. Then he stood in the chapel and looked at Seraphina with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The expression of a man managing something he did not know how to stop managing. "People keep knowing something about me that I do not know myself," she said. Cassian said nothing. "What is blood fever?" His mouth tightened. "It is what the council calls it." "And what do you call it?" Silence stretched between them like a rope pulled from both ends. That evening, Seraphina went to the restricted archive. She told herself she was only looking for her family's old records. She was not only looking for her family's old records. The burned page was behind the 3rd shelf on the east wall, tucked into a folder that had been filed under a name that was not her mother's name, but that contained a notation she recognized: the border seal of Vey House. The page had been partially destroyed, but the center line was legible, her mother's name, and beneath it, in the precise administrative language of a council record: Moonfire carrier, terminated before ignition. Seraphina stood in the archive for a long time. Her hands were very steady. The blue fire under her skin was not. She found Cassian in the war room before he could find her. She set the burned page on the table between them and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me everything." Cassian looked at the page. His expression was the one she was beginning to understand was not coldness. It was a man who had made a decision he now recognized as wrong and had not yet learned how to say. So he told her. Old reports had come to him before the wedding, not from the council, but from an archivist who had been quietly keeping records about bloodline patterns in allied noble houses. Seraphina's mother had been a Moonfire carrier. There was reason to suspect Seraphina might carry the same blood. A royal alpha's kiss could awaken it. If Moonfire flared publicly during or after the wedding, the council had both the right and the motivation to invoke the bloodline containment statute. Imprisonment, possibly worse. Cassian had refused to kiss her because one unguarded contact might ignite a flame that would give Marceline everything she needed. He had thought he was protecting her. He had thought that distance was the same as safety. Seraphina listened to all of it. Then she said, "Did you ever think I deserved to know what lived in my own blood?" The war room was very quiet. Cassian did not have an answer. Not a good one. Not one that held together under the weight of what he was being asked. "You let me believe you hated me," she said. "You watched me spend 3 days wondering what I had done wrong. You kept my own body a secret from me. I know what you were trying to do." Her voice was level. That was not mercy. That was a woman who had learned precision with words, the same way she had learned precision with everything else. That does not make it right. She left him standing in the war room. She went to find healer Orla. Orla Thorne had a face that had been honest for a long time and had the particular lines that came from knowing something painful and carrying it alone. She had treated Seraphina's mother. She had signed the false death record. She told Seraphina both of these things in the same voice, quiet, careful, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed an apology for years and found that rehearsing it had not made it easier. Moonfire was not a sickness. It was not instability. It was a silver-blue flame that reacted to corruption inside bonds. Blood oaths, wolf vows, forced commands, pack-linked magic. It had been used for generations as a way to cleanse forced bindings from those who had been compelled rather than chosen. The disaster had come from one incident centuries ago. A Moonfire bearer whose alpha husband had commanded her to burn an enemy bloodline through their shared blood bonds. Because the fire was used through command, through coercion, through fear, through someone else's need, it could not distinguish. It spread. It killed people who had not been named. And the council wrote the history of that event. And the history said that Moonfire carriers were unstable, that they could not be trusted, that the power itself was corrupt. The hidden truth, Orla said, was that Moonfire became catastrophic when forced, when commanded, when fear was the teacher. Seraphina's mother had not died of blood fever. She had died because the council attempted to extract Moonfire from a living carrier, while she held infant Seraphina in her arms. She had refused to let go. Orla had signed the death record because she was afraid. She had carried that afraid for 24 years. Seraphina did not forgive her in that room, but she held the information carefully, the way she held anything true that had been given to her too late, and she asked Orla what she needed to learn. Learning Moonfire alone was not the same as learning it well. Seraphina discovered this 3 days after Orla's revelation, in the small hours of a night when she had told herself she would only try a small thing, a test, a tiny confirmation, Proof that the fire inside her could be held and shaped and made to obey the way any skill obeyed when practiced quietly. She was studying a stolen copy of a forced oath document when the flame reacted, not to the document. To the person standing in the corridor outside her door, Tobin was a palace page, 14 years old, slight, with the watchful eyes of a boy who had learned very early that being useful was the same as being safe. Seraphina had seen him before. She had not known until the silver-blue fire reached toward the corridor like a hand identifying something wrong, that Tobin carried a forced oath mark on his left palm. A council servant had pressed it into his skin after he witnessed something he was not meant to witness. Bloodline prisoners moved through the passages beneath the palace, in the dark, without record. The mark was meant to seal his silence. What it had done was press a corruption into a 14-year-old's hand and call it administrative procedure. Moonfire found it before Seraphina could name a boundary. She tried. She said the word. Only the corruption, but panic had already thinned her intent, and the fire moved too fast and too rough, like a blade drawn by someone who had practiced the motion, but not the restraint. Tobin cried out. The mark burned. It did not kill him, but it burned the skin around the oath mark, trying to get to the corruption beneath it, and the sound he made was the sound of a boy in pain. And Seraphina felt the fire die in her hands, as if it had taken the last of her air with it. She got to Tobin first. Cassian arrived 3 minutes later. He did not command her calm. He did not demand an accounting. He knelt on the corridor floor, some feet back from where Seraphina was crouched with Tobin's hand between hers, and he said, "Where am I allowed to stand?" Seraphina looked at him over Tobin's head. She moved to the side. She allowed him closer, not touching, but closer. It was the first real thing they had shared. Tobin's oath mark was documented that night, which meant it became evidence. Orla treated the burn. Seraphina sat with Tobin until he slept, and then sat with the knowledge of what she had done a while longer. Shame was not the same as control. She understood that now, in the particular way, you understand something that has cost someone else. Days later, in the moon garden, Cassian stood beside her under the oldest silver tree in the palace grounds and taught her breathing technique used to resist alpha rage, the slow architecture of inhale and hold and deliberate exhale that pulled a wolf back from the edge of its own instincts. He had never taught it to anyone else. He said so without ceremony, as if it were a fact rather than a gift. Seraphina adapted it. The breath did not suppress Moonfire. It gave it a shape to move inside, a channel rather than a cage. She practiced it until the garden went dark. At one point, their hands came within an inch of each other on the stone railing. Neither of them moved. Not from disgust, not from distance, from the same understanding that they were both holding something dangerous and both beginning. For the first time, to be honest about what it was, the distance was no longer imposed. It was chosen. That was different. A week later, alone in her room with a silver bowl from the palace kitchen and 3 folded hours before dawn, Seraphina created a flame, small, deliberate. She held a false oath document above the bowl and named the boundary out loud, the way Orla had told her to name it. Only the corruption. Silver blue fire rose from her palm and touched the document. The forced oath mark on the paper, a common administrative seal that the council used to bind servants to silence, burned away in 3 clean seconds without scorching a single thread of the paper beneath it. Seraphina set the document down. She held the bowl in both hands until the fire was gone. Her hands were trembling. The flame had obeyed. She had not known until that moment whether it would. She had not known until that moment whether she believed it could. She sat in the quiet of her room and breathed, and did not call it a victory, because it was not a victory. It was only the first true proof that she was not what the council had decided she was. Marceline moved the following week. She presented the consummation challenge before the full court with the specific timing of someone who had been waiting for a moment when the room was full enough to make refusal look like an admission. The marriage had not been consummated. The bloodline of the queen had not been cleared by royal contact. Under the terms of the old law, the councils had standing to question the queen's legal status. Seraphina understood the trap as it was being constructed. If the consummation challenge succeeded, she would lose queen's standing. Without standing, the royal protection that covered her as Alpha King's wife would no longer apply. Without that protection, she would be an ordinary noble woman carrying suspect blood, and under the bloodline containment statute, that was enough for the council to move against her. One challenge into the next, untouched bride, challenged queen, exposed carrier, council prisoner. Marceline had built it so that every step looked like law. Cassian defended her publicly. His defense was precise and political and well prepared, and it did not matter. Seraphina could see that it did not matter. A defense without proof only told the room that the king was protecting something, and what the room heard was that the king was protecting something that required protection. Court opinion turned with the slowness of something large shifting its weight. And then it was simply in a different position than it had been before. She was watching her own reputation become a liability. Prince Cassian found her in the East Library 2 days after the council session. He was the kind of man who moved through rooms at an angle, who said things that meant something adjacent to what they appeared to mean, who smiled at the right times and looked elsewhere at the wrong ones. Seraphina had been watching him. He had been meeting with Marceline. "The council is not afraid of your fire," he said. He was looking at the window. "They are afraid someone will see what it burns." Seraphina said nothing. She held the words until the shape they revealed became clear. She did not know whether to trust him. She did not know, yet, that she did not have to decide today. The eclipse attack began 3 days later. It came from the border, 600 miles north. A fortress that guarded the mountain pass that nothing large could cross without. Eclipse raiders. Their magic used corrupted pack-link bonds to turn allied warriors against their own packs, to feed doubt and fear into the connection between wolves until the bond itself became a weapon aimed the wrong direction. Marceline invoked the emergency weapon mandate before the first healer reports had finished arriving. The council, she argued, had the right to requisition forbidden magical assets for supervised military use during a kingdom-level magical attack. Seraphina was the asset. Cassian refused, and that night, in the margin of a briefing document on her desk, Seraphina found a note she had not placed there. A safe house address, a command sequence for the guards outside her door, instructions for what to do if her Moonfire flared during the crisis. She did not need to ask whose handwriting it was. She found Cassian in the strategy room. She put the note on the map table between them. "You are still protecting me from danger," she said, "by taking away my choice to face it." Cassian looked at the note. Something in his face moved through several rooms very quickly. "It is only emergency preparation. You decided what I was allowed to know about my own danger." She waited. He understood. He withdrew the order. She did not thank him for it. Correcting a second mistake was not the same as having not made it. But she registered that he had recognized it. That was something. The next morning, Seraphina told him she was going to the border, not asking, telling. "You do not get to protect me from becoming a weapon," she said, "by locking me away like one." She chose to go, Cassian chose to accompany her, not commanding, not escorting, beside her. They rode north. The eclipse corruption was worse at the border than the reports had described. Seraphina could feel it before she saw it. A sour wrongness in the air, like the smell of a vow that had curdled inside the person who made it. At the outer camp, a warrior fell beside them in the middle of a sentence. His eyes had gone the pale blurred color of someone whose pack link was being turned against him. Seraphina stepped toward him instinctively. Moonfire rose in her hands, silver blue and exact, and she named the boundary before she touched him. Only the eclipse corruption. The fire found what was wrong and cleaned it. The warrior came back to himself in seconds. Riven. Cassian's guard captain had watched from 3 feet away with a hand on his blade and an expression that was trying very hard to be professional. He did not draw. But Seraphina saw something else when she lowered her hands. The scar on Riven's left wrist, a curved mark she had noticed before without thinking. About it had gone faintly silver for the 3 seconds her fire was active, the same silver as a forced oath mark reacting to heat it recognized. She said nothing about it, but she filed it away in the part of her mind that kept things until she had enough pieces to see what shape they made. He watched Seraphina's hands until she lowered them, and then watched the scar on his own wrist for a moment longer. That night, eclipse corruption crept into the packlink node at the center of the forward camp. Cassian collapsed in the command tent. Seraphina was beside him before she knew she had moved. The corruption had threaded through the royal line, through the bond that connected Cassian's blood to every wolf under his command, and it was spreading. She knew what she was holding. She knew what a kiss would do. She leaned toward him in the dim tent and felt the moonfire rise with the particular urgency of a power that had been waiting a long time to be needed. Cassian, even half-conscious, even in the grip of eclipse corruption, turned his face away. "Don't," he said. "Cassian, I will not make fear the first thing your fire remembers." She pulled back. She sat with that for a moment. The camp was loud outside. Inside the tent, his breathing was steadier than she had expected, and she understood that he was not refusing to let her help. He was refusing to be the reason her power awakened in a moment of panic and desperation. He did not want Moonfire's first true waking to be a crisis. He wanted it to be a choice. She hated that she understood. Orla arrived from the rear camp before Cassian deteriorated further and burned the corruption from him through older, slower methods that left both of them exhausted. And Orla, sitting across from Seraphina in the gray hour before dawn, told her the last piece. Seraphina's mother had not been consumed by Moonfire. She had not lost control. The council had attempted to extract Moonfire from a living carrier through force, and Seraphina's mother had protected an infant in her arms and refused to submit, and the fire had burned back what was coming for her child. She had not been a monster. She had been a mother who refused to let go. The council had feared her because she had resisted being used, not because she was unstable. Because she said no. Seraphina sat with that until the sun came up. Then Marceline arrived at the border camp with 6 council guards and a document. She presented the exposure before the full assembled army. She named Seraphina's blood. She named the law. She produced records, old, partial, just complete enough. She declared that the queen was Moonfire. The camp went rigid. Warriors who had fought beside Seraphina all of yesterday moved back in the particular, involuntary way of people who have just been told that something familiar is now dangerous. Riven's hand was on his blade. Seraphina's veins had gone silver blue, not from fear. From the camp around her, from the corrupted pack link that was still spreading, from the Eclipse Raiders hitting the eastern perimeter with their second wave. She felt the fire in her clearly. Not the panic of the night with Tobin, not the careful controlled test in the bowl. This was Moonfire meeting the thing it had been made to meet. She stepped forward, toward the army, not away. "If you fear what I am," she said, "then watch what I choose." Kalen spoke from the back of the crowd before anyone else could respond. He had arrived with a sealed case. He presented it to the senior council witness with the air of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had not enjoyed waiting. The case held documents. Payment transfers from Marceline's council accounts to 3 Eclipse Raider command posts. Border Patrol rotation adjustments that had created a clean passage north at the exact time the first raid had come through. Internal council correspondence about the emergency weapon mandate. Written before the attack, not after. A plan. Marceline had not reacted to the attack. She had prepared for it. She had needed a crisis large enough to justify invoking emergency law. She had needed Seraphina to ignite publicly in front of witnesses. She had needed the monster. Marceline looked at the documents and said, very calmly, that none of this changed what Moonfire was. What it had already done. What it would do. Then she reached into her sleeve and activated the blood relic, a small carved thing, older than anything Seraphina had been told to expect, containing royal alpha blood from a line she did not immediately recognize. The relic forced ignition. Moonfire rose through Seraphina without her intent silver blue and violent, and looking for the nearest bound thing to tear. She felt it spreading toward the warriors behind her, toward the pack-link bonds of men who had done nothing wrong, toward everything tethered and close. She could not hold the boundary, not from here, not alone against something designed by a century of fear. Cassian moved. Not toward the warriors, not toward Marceline, toward her. He had already removed his gloves. He stopped one step away and held both hands open at his sides. Not reaching, not commanding, not the posture of a man who had decided for her. "Do you want me with you?" The fire was spreading through her veins, looking for something to choose for itself. Seraphina chose first. She reached for him. The kiss was not long. It was not theatrical. It was simply the first time Moonfire woke through consent rather than coercion, through her hand pulling him in, through his palm against her face without grip, through the silver blue flame, finding a royal alpha blood it recognized and rising, the way a fire rises when it finally has the air it needs. Not a weapon, not an accident, a choice. Then Seraphina set the boundary, only the eclipse corruption. The words came clean this time. Her voice did not crack. It turned, not to the warriors, to the corrupted nodes still threaded through the pack link around the camp, to the eclipse magic still attached to the bond network, to the relic in Marceline's hand. The relic shattered. Marceline stumbled. The eclipse corruption in the camp burned away in sheets, not slowly, not surgically, but completely. Warriors came back to themselves gasping. The raider attack on the eastern perimeter collapsed when the corrupted advantage vanished. Seraphina's veins went cold. Her wolf went silent. Her hands were shaking. She stood in the middle of the camp and looked at the space where the eclipse corruption had been. Riven lowered his blade. He had seen her choose. He had seen her hold the boundary when the relic had tried to take it from her. He had seen her refuse to burn what she had not named. He knelt, not from command, not from the Alpha line, from the particular respect of a soldier who had watched something choose restraint, when restraint was the harder thing. Marceline was still speaking. She was telling the council witness that this was exactly the danger, that an uncontrolled Moonfire carrier had just used forbidden power on a military field, that the law required. Seraphina said, "My blood is not your weapon." Her voice was hoarse from the fire. "My fire is not your proof that I am a monster." She looked at Marceline, "And my silence was never your right." Marceline did not stop. She turned to the council witness and invoked the emergency weapon mandate, loudly, formally, in the precise language of someone who had memorized the statute years ago, in anticipation of exactly this moment. The Queen had used forbidden power in an unsupervised military context. The law was clear. The danger had been demonstrated. The council had both standing and obligation to act. She said all of it without raising her voice. She had been right about so many things for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like for the room not to follow her. Kalen set his case on the ground in front of the council witness. Orla stood from where she had been treating warriors at the camp edge and walked forward. Riven turned toward the witness and named himself, his rank, and what he had observed. Tobin was not at the border, but his forced oath mark was. In the documentation Seraphina had filed after the night in the corridor, in the council servant's name attached to it, in the administrative record that connected it to the same authorization chain that ran through Marceline's office. The council witness looked at everything on the table. Then he looked at Marceline. "The emergency weapon mandate," he said, "applies to assets of the kingdom, not to its queens. Marceline was arrested. Cassian did not make the order." Seraphina had already spoken. The council witness made the determination based on what was in the case. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Marceline was charged with conspiring with Eclipse raiders, falsifying Moonfire history, ordering extractions and erasures of carriers, attempting to weaponize a sitting queen, and endangering the kingdom to justify control. She was convicted. Orla stood before the court and admitted she had signed Seraphina's mother's false death record. She provided the true medical notes she had kept for 24 years inside a lockbox. She had never quite been able to destroy. She did not ask for leniency. Kalen lost political trust, not for the exposure itself, but for the years of silence before it, for the calculation in how and when he had chosen to act. He accepted restricted oversight. He opened sealed files for record restoration. Riven began a military review of forced oath marks throughout the kingdom. His brother's death record was reopened. What the review found would take months to process. But the pattern was there, in the administrative language of council documents, in the record of what had been suppressed and when. His brother had not died because Moonfire was free. His brother had died because Moonfire had been forced. Tobin's oath mark became evidence. He served in the palace now, without a seal on his palm, with the particular careful relief of a boy who had stopped being afraid that his silence was the only thing keeping him safe. The council offered Seraphina the title of Royal Moonfire Protector. She said, "No, my power is not state property. No carrier's power is state property." She remained queen. Not because the council had permitted it. Not because the marriage owned her. Because she chose to continue standing there. Because she had decided that fear would not annul what she now had the right to define. Some weeks after the trial, in the quiet hour before the winter court session began, Cassian came to the archive Seraphina was cataloging. He did not pretend that was not what she was doing. He stood inside the door for a moment, and then he said, "May I come closer?" She set down her pen. Yes. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the table and did not reach for her. "I knew enough to suspect your bloodline before the wedding," he said. "I withheld truth because I believed distance was the same as safety. I let you believe rejection was the price of protection. I repeated that mistake with the safe house. I should have trusted you with your own danger." Seraphina looked at him. "I know," she said. "These are not new things you are telling me." "No," he said, "but I have not said them directly." The archive was quiet around them. "The hurt does not disappear," she said, "because you name it accurately. I know that too." She looked at her hands on the table. Then she said, "The door is open, that is where we are." That was not forgiveness. It was not a return to something. It was what came after the room had been emptied and someone had left the door open, and the air was finally moving through. That was enough to begin from. 3 weeks later, Cassian returned to the wedding chamber. The same silver candles, the same moon-white roses on the bed, replaced now with fresh ones, because someone on the palace staff had continued ordering them every week, as if in anticipation of something. The same moonlight through the same window. He stood at the door. "May I come closer?" he asked. Seraphina was standing by the window, not at the bed, not near the crown, just at the window where the moonlight fell at the same angle it always had. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room until he was close enough that the space between them was a choice, rather than a distance. He asked before he reached for her hand. She allowed it. No fire flared out of control. The silver blue was there. It was always there. She understood now, the way any living thing was always present, but it was not straining. It was still. "The first night," Cassian said, "I promised you everything except myself." Seraphina looked at his face in the candlelight, and I almost believed that was all I deserved. He held her gaze. "May I kiss you?" She smiled. It was not a comfortable smile. It had too much history in it for comfort, but it was real. "Only if you understand what it means now," Cassian said. "It means you choose me." He paused. "Not that I awaken you." Seraphina closed the distance. Moonfire rose silver blue and warm and quiet, moving through the wedding chamber like light through water. Not a weapon, not a curse, not the disaster the council had written into every record it controlled. Just a living flame. Present, chosen, her own. 1 year later, during a winter ceremony in the palace hall, a child standing near the front of the gathered court flinched at something in the crowd. A small flame appeared in the air beside her, silver blue, confused, the fire of something that did not yet know itself. The court went still with the specific stillness of people who had been told for generations to be afraid of exactly this. Seraphina crossed the hall before the silence could become something worse. She knelt before the child, not commanding, not reaching, not placing herself between the child and the fire. She asked first, "May I sit beside you?" The child, who was perhaps 7, nodded with the gravity of someone taking the question seriously. Seraphina sat on the stone floor in her queen's dress and looked at the flame hovering in the cold air. "Tell the fire what you want it to save," she said. The child thought about this for a moment. Then she whispered, "My mother." The flame curled toward the child's hands and settled into a small, still glow, silver blue and harmless and patient, waiting to be understood. Seraphina looked up. Cassian was standing at the throne steps. He had not moved to intervene. He had not positioned himself in front of her. He was simply there, beside the place where she had been standing, watching the hall the way a man watches something he trusts. Seraphina looked back at the child. The flame was still glowing. The court was still quiet. But the quiet had changed, from fear of something wrong to the particular stillness of people watching something they did not yet have a name for, because every name they had been given had been the wrong one. For the first time in recorded history, Moonfire burned in the royal hall, and no one called it a monster.